So there was a recent video between Jordan Peterson and Mohammed Hijab. I'll leave a link in the description if you haven't checked that out yet. But today I want to talk about someone else reacting to that video. Uh, and this guy had a complaint against how Jordan Peterson read the Bible, and apparently this guy has solved Jesus. And so let's watch it together.
So, Jordan Peterson views the story of Christianity and the story of Christ through this lens of, I could say, like spiritualizing the text, or not even really spiritualizing it, but like psychoanalyzing it. And it's probably because he comes from a psychologist background. So, he reads into the text in this specific way. And if you've ever watched any of his biblical lectures, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But he kind of has this like postmodern way of interpreting the text, and I'll get into what that looks like in a second. Where on the other hand, Muhammad looks at biblical text as historical fact, right? He looks at it for what it is. He obviously disagrees with Christianity, but when looking at biblical text, he looks at it through a historical lens, as these are things that actually happened, right? So when discussing something like the Bible that was written for a specific reason, you have to read it in the way that it was supposed to be read, right?
How do you do that? Right? How do you know how it's supposed to be read? All right. I just want to start off with that question.
And what Jordan does with essentially the story of Jesus Christ, right? He looks at the crucifixion as he puts it, as the culmination of all suffering. And you can look at that and then reflect on your own life, in your own suffering, and kind of use it as like a parallel. And although, yeah, I guess you kind of could, but you might be crossing the lines of blasphemy. But
Well, there's two things. One, so like, I get that Christians in some sense want to take it very literally, and I think that's what this guy's going to do. But then, even if you take this symbolic representation, what is the meaning behind the story of Jesus, and you want to interpret it in that way, that doesn't actually invalidate whether or not it was a historical fact, right? It just says that this is symbolized this way. Like if you talk about the current political climate and somebody's upset, some group's upset about a particular thing, and then you try to understand symbolically where this anger is coming from and what it represents. That doesn't invalidate the validity of the experience, the fact that it actually happened. It's giving a different perspective. And with the way that Jordan Peterson talks about Christianity, you could ask the question, why is it that the story of Christ is so compelling? And then if you try to ask that question, then it's, like you need to take more of the spiritual kind of view of it to answer such a question, because there certainly are certain stories that are more compelling than others.
putting yourself on that cross. But that's not how it was written. And Muhammad has a better understanding of this.
How do you know how it was written? That's the thing that I think we'll talk about this more in a bit, but just say that's not how it was written. How do you know how it was written?
It seems, than Jordan does. And so let's dig into this a little bit. So the way Jordan looks at the text of the Bible, right? He looks at it as, all right, let's just look at the crucifixion and the passion narrative in the way that Jordan looks at it, right? He says you can look at the text, and then you could have like 100 different people look at that text and come up with 100 different reasons for why it's saying this and what it actually means and the philosophical meanings or spiritual meanings behind it. So you could have 100 different people reading the text and come up with 100 different ways to view it. And although that is true, on the surface, you could have 100 different people read it and it could mean 100 different things to different people. But when you're reading something, you have to read it as it was written. And this is what I mean. Let's say I write a letter to my wife, right? And then 2,000 years from now, somebody finds that letter. Now, you could have 100 different people read that letter, and in reading that letter, come up with 100 different reasons for why it was written or what it's actually saying. But the truth of that letter is that it is a letter from a specific person, me, to another specific person, my wife, in a language that both of us are going to comprehend, even using like slang words of this time that both of us will comprehend, right? She'll know exactly what I'm talking about if I'm talking about specific situations that went on in our life. I'm going to be speaking to her in a way that a husband speaks to a wife, and more specifically in how me as a husband speaks to my wife as my wife. And it's going to be written in the context of my day. Now, if
All right, so this analogy Okay, he's about to say this, but the idea is he's trying to paint this as, okay, so there is a specific way that the book is written, the story's written, but now you have this analogy. Even in this analogy, okay, fine, you write a letter to your wife, then 2,000 years later, like, yeah, sure, there is a true meaning to what what the letter says, but nobody 2,000 years ago knows that, right? Like, who knows what I don't even think you know what you were thinking to answer the question fully of why I wrote the letter that I wrote, right? And so, especially some 2,000 years from now, like, how the hell are they going to know? And then the part that is super frustrating about this to me is this guy's going to somehow claim that he knows what was in the mind of, essentially God, the people before us that wrote these texts, right? It's like, I don't know. It's just, that's incredibly arrogant. And yeah, we'll let him finish on this analogy and see what he says.
Somebody 2,000 years from now finds that letter, shows it to 100 people, and they all interpret it different ways and find some like psychoanalytical reasoning for why it was written and what it actually means. That's cool, but it's also wrong.
It's not wrong. It's not wrong. Why do you do the things you do? Why does, if something your wife does annoys you, why? Why does it annoy you? Do you actually know that? Nobody actually, you don't fully know why you do the things that you do, right? And so that's the whole point of psychology, is to try to answer that, right? So even in the example of this letter with your wife, it's ridiculous, right? Like, you don't know why exactly you wrote it. You said exactly what you said. And so there is an element of trying to understand psychologically. Even today, if today I read a letter from you to your wife, it would be the same thing. And to say that that's wrong, like, your arrogance is insane to just say, no, like, I know the correct answer, period, And then it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think this is why people get frustrated with religious people. It's kind of this, that there's this level of arrogance with it, of somehow I know the correct answer. It's first saying, okay, there is a correct answer, and it's like, okay, fair enough. I think I could agree with that. There is a, ideal way, and there is an initial intent on how these things were read and stuff. But then you're not going that far and just saying that. You're now saying, well, the way Jordan Peterson does it is wrong, but the way I do it is correct. And it's like, like, Jesus Christ, like, the arrogance in that is just insane.
Because I wrote the letter to my wife for a specific reason, during a specific time, in a specific language. And the letter is meant to mean what I say it means.
No, it's not what you say it means. Like, that's not even true in this example, right? Like, have you ever said something to someone and then later taken it back and be like, oh, I didn't actually mean that. I didn't this. It's like, we are insanely complex creatures, all right? So, like, even, like, your analogy even falls apart in this kind of, like, really trivialized example of you writing a letter to your wife, right? You don't know what you mean, and just because you say something doesn't mean it's true. And oftentimes, I mean, you definitely see this, if you in the audience, if you've ever had a relationship with anybody, romantic or otherwise, but let's imagine romantic, like, you'll say something, and then your partner might even say to you, that's not what you meant, that's not this, and then it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? And I feel like this guy's just gonna be like, look, bitch, I said it, and that's what it is. But then it's like, no, well, you have innuendo, and you're not necessarily bringing up to the front of what you actually meant by this, and there's kind of hidden meaning underneath it, and maybe she's picking up on that, even though you're saying this, and so then there's an incongruence between what you say and what's actually being meant by it, and, like, language is so incredibly complicated. Like, so this analogy even falls apart in your trivial example, let alone in the possibly the most complicated text that's ever existed in human history, this, divine text from these religious things. And then it's like, yeah. So I just want to point that out. He's going to get more, and I'll pick up more on this in a bit.
And in that context is the truth about my letter. And this is how the Bible was written. Each book of the Bible was written to a specific group of people at a specific time, in a specific context, for a specific reason, and in a way that the people of that time will comprehend it when they're reading it. And that's how we have to read the Bible, through that literal interpretation.
Through that literal interpretation. Okay, so in Genesis 1, right, do you take that literally? Right? So what does it mean for, God's face to be, the Spirit of God to be over the water? I forget the exact phrasing like that, but it's like, what does that mean? Right? That's completely symbolic, right? And then in the Genesis 1 story, I think it's day 3, he creates trees and vegetation, and then on day 4, he creates the sun. Like, obviously you don't create the trees before the sun, right? And then you can say like, oh, well, it's God. It's like, well, is this God that you imagine just fucking retarded? You just, oh yeah, I think I'll just, like, even though I'm all knowing and all powerful, what I literally did was make the trees before the sun. It's not like, oh, there's actually a symbolic reason for that, and I did a video actually on kind of the symbolic reason, the symbolic interpretation of Genesis 1. I'll leave in, a little pin somewhere on the video. But it's like, no, you're not supposed to take that literally. And then if you look at Genesis 2, the creation story is a completely different creation story than Genesis 1. There's contradictory elements in it. And so it's like, okay, am I supposed to take this literally? Or am I supposed to take this symbolically? Right? And then it's like, some of the things are just full-blown poems. They're songs. It's like, no, the Bible is a library. And it's not obvious, all right? Like in the Bible, it doesn't say, oh, here's the nonfiction section and here's the, poetry section. And it's this like kind of just really elegant kind of, beautiful culmination of all these different things that are kind of poetic, and some are literal historical documents. But then it's like, even if somehow it was, and somehow in the Bible there was a nonfiction and a fiction section, and suppose, a particular story is in this nonfiction section, so it means you're supposed to take it literally. What does it even mean to take it literally, right? So I had this conversation with my dad recently, and he was talking about the word default. So, he's not the most familiar with technology, let's say, and he had to insert a credit card, and it said, default credit card, right? And so he interpreted that as like, oh shit, like somehow I defaulted on my credit card. Like somehow my credit card was canceled, right? And then to me, it's like, no, it means you have to specify, the credit card you want to be automatically used, right? And so to him, even the word default, one generation before me, has a radically different meaning, right, than how I interpret the word default. And then 2,000 years later, it's like, even if we have the same words, and obviously they didn't speak the same words, we've translated it from the original text to this. So, you also have to have faith in whoever did the translation. But then, even putting that point aside, it's like, you think the ancient people, when they talk about light, are saying, oh, it's an electromagnetic wave with a wavelength between 400 and 700 nanometers? Like, obviously not. So then it's like, even words that are used in the biblical language and our words don't mean the same thing. So then, okay, if you say take a literal interpretation, how? How do I take a literal interpretation? We don't even speak the same language, right? So it's like this literalist view of this is just like, it's so fucking stupid to me.
Now, there are parts of the Bible that are more spiritualized, that are more allegorical, that are poetry. Okay. There's songs in the Bible. There's psalms in the Bible. So there are differences in each book of the Bible, but they still fall into the context category that we just placed them in, which is written to a specific group of people for a specific purpose during a specific time. And this is...
Sure. Like, nobody doubts that. Like, obviously, you said it about anything that's ever been written, ever. It has a specific purpose and a specific context and whatever, but you don't know that. You don't know what that is. You don't know what is the context. What is the purpose? I don't even know if you know who the audience is, right? The Old Testament. Where did that come from? I mean, it's not like the story of Christ where we have the Gospels and that this is, based off of these historical documents. The Old Testament, we don't have that. God only knows where these things originated from, what influenced them, where did they start, how long ago were they first kind of developed, and we don't know that. So, it's like, fine, you're right, but nobody knows what that is. Nobody knows what the correct context is, But you're sitting here saying, I do know, and it's not what Jordan Peterson says. And it's like, it's not even... oh, well, what Jordan Peterson said is this, and I'm going to critique that because I don't think that that's exactly true. I actually think what's going on in the Bible is this thing. Because, like, that would be an interesting discussion. But instead, you just say, oh, I got the direct phone line to God, and he told me, no, that Jordan Peterson guy, what he says about the Bible is wrong. And don't worry, John, you know it, not Jordan.
Is how Muhammad reads the text, which is actually the correct way to read it. Jordan's way of reading the Bible,
it's the way that agrees with
very
you.
deep and very, well thought out. It is the incorrect way to be reading it if you're trying to find the actual truth of the Bible. Now, yes.
Like, that's so arrogant. You shouldn't do it that way to find the actual truth, Like, anyway, I've really kind of beaten a dead horse here.
There are plenty of stories in the Bible filled with inspirational stories of suffering and triumph and love and war. And you can take all of these stories and create parallels to human life today. But again, although you can do that, that is not how the Bible was written. Now, moving on to how Mohammed Hijab views this, right? Although he views the biblical text in a historical context, what I find interesting is he goes on to say that in the Quran, there's passages that say, hey, test this. We got evidence that this is true. And if it doesn't hold up to the evidence, then, it's not true, right? So that's how I actually came to Christianity, was the evidence for
the evidence, right? So the evidence of Christianity was so compelling, right? You had Jesus, the Son of God, born of a virgin. That sounds, rationally, logical to you. And I know I probably sound like an atheist. If you haven't seen my content, it probably just sounds like I'm some atheist Christian basher, and I'm not. I consider myself a Christian, but it's just such a stupid way to go about it. It's not about logical, rational things. God the Creator made the earth in 7 days, and he made the trees before the sun, and then Jesus was born of, a virgin, and all this other stuff. It's it's not supposed to be rational, right? That's not the intent of this. If it was rational, it wouldn't be mysterious, right? And the mysterious is what garnishes the awe that comes from the religious faith, right? It's not supposed to be, and what evidence brought you to Christianity? So you logically ended up at the story of Christ and believing in God through the biblical story? I would love to hear how that happened.
the resurrection, Jesus Christ being a historical figure, and all of the historical facts that we have about Christianity, the early church, the resurrection, all of that stuff, right? So Muhammad actually, he goes through some of these things. I mean, he discusses the Gospel of Thomas, which was kind of interesting to me, because if you're going to be viewing things through the historical context lens, and then you bring in the Gospel of Thomas, which is well known to be a later forgery, then it's well, how well are you paying attention to the actual history? But that's, I guess...
No, this part's a valid point. I don't want to just bash this guy the whole time. That's, I think it's a valid point that you shouldn't, pick and choose and say, okay, I'm going to take this, because, I mean, that's the idea of confirmation bias, right? It's I'm going to pick the stories that agree with my preconceived notions, and I'm not going to be open-minded to different views. So, it's important to, I agree with him on this, it's important to be careful on kind of, where you draw your evidence for whatever conclusion you're coming from. He is, and, try to do it in a way that's, I don't like the word unbiased for some reason, so let's say open-minded.
It's a video for another time. But, so he goes through all of these things that Islam believes about Christ, right? Now, he said things like they believe that he did miracles with God's permission, but if you look at the Bible, there was no, God's permission. Jesus...
What does it mean, with God's permission, right? It's so funny, because it's, this, I feel like I'm saying the same thing to this person that I say to atheists, and it's now I kind of understand why atheists are the way they are, because of people like this, But it's do you even know what that means, with God's permission? What does that actually mean? If Jesus were to do this with God's permission, you would expect in the Bible, it would just say, and God told Jesus, it's okay to do this. And that's what's meant by God's permission. It's this is a miracle. This is a divine work, right? And God is the source of that which is divine. And so God granted Jesus the power to perform these miracles, right? And it's that, you can just sum that up with, and God gave Christ permission, And I don't know, it's just, your literal interpretation of these things are so ridiculous. I really want to have a conversation with this guy or other people like this.
Jesus said, hey, you're healed, and you were healed. He didn't, ask God the Father to do that. Muhammad also has a kind of distorted view of the Trinity. This isn't the video for that. I'll leave a video.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I plan to make a video on this too. Trinity. I mean, I think a lot of Christians kind of have the idea wrong too. And it that's arrogant of me to say. Let's say I have a different way that I interpret the Trinity, and it aligns with, other, let's say, theologians that I've heard talk about it. So I plan to do a video on that, and if you're watching this afterwards, I'll try to put a clip somewhere on the screen that you can click to go see that video.
Video about the Trinity at the end of this. So if you want to learn about it from somebody who used to be a Muslim, who is now a Christian, well, has since passed away, but they're a Christian, I'll leave that at the end. He also talks about how agnostics and secular and atheist historians believe that Jesus Christ existed. And I'll add to that in them believing that, The reason they believe it is because of the documentation we have for the death, burial, resurrection, and Jesus' life. Whether you believe he rose from the dead or not, it is a historical fact that his disciples believed that he rose from the dead. And it's also a historical fact that he was crucified by Roman crucifixion.
I do want to push back a bit on the idea of a historical fact. Like, I hate when people say stuff like this, Like, I'm a scientist, so, I'm a PhD student in physics in my last year at UC Berkeley. Really good school of theoretical physics. I want to put that out here, but I wouldn't even say it's a scientific fact about something, right? Let alone a historical fact. And then science at least has the advantage of reproducibility, right? You could say like, okay, well, scientifically, my theory predicts this, and I observe that. And then in principle, you can go observe that. And so there's this element of reproducibility in it. And I still wouldn't even use the word scientific fact, because like when you think of fact, you think of something that's irrefutable, 100% proven, no wavering on any of this, right? And I wouldn't even claim science could get that, let alone history. It's like, what the hell is a historian fact, And then it's like, okay, well, if this was a historical fact, why do people still research this, Like, wouldn't the problem just be over, and then historians are like, oh, okay, I'm going to go on to something else now because it's been historically proven as a fact? I mean, I don't know. Anyway.
Fiction. And what I find interesting is that although Muhammad views the biblical text through the historical lens, one thing that Islam denies, although they have Jesus as a central figure, they deny the crucifixion. They say that Jesus was never crucified. And
I don't know if that's true or not. Yeah.
That's just inaccurate. So I find it interesting that although...
That's also like historically, right? So then, okay, let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, I'm not sure if this is true, but let's suppose that Islam says that Jesus was not crucified, but Christianity says that he was. Then which one do you believe, right? Like, and then you're going to say, oh, well, you should take these. And then obviously if Muslims believe that this wasn't true, they would say, no, you should take these texts. It's like, well, okay, well, what do you do in that case then, And it's like, this is why I really don't like the idea of using kind of, your set of canonical texts as evidence for the existence of something. Like, the canonical text should be a way for your ancestors to be able to speak to you about how to think about something. But you shouldn't rely on the ancient text, or any text for that matter, as a justification for something. You say, this story says it, and therefore it's true. It's like, okay, well, imagine if someone else was telling you, hey, this is true, and you want to, and then they try to outline why they believe that, then the answer isn't, this thing's true because, homeboy over here says it's true. It's true because of this rationale, right? And it's like, I don't know. Yeah, I really got a problem with kind of, these like Christian fundamentalists who kind of take that approach to things, and even like scientific fundamentalists. If I'm going to coin that term, it's not present, but I think it's actually childish, right? I mean, like when you're a kid, you have rules dictated to you by your parents, and so it's kind of like, oh, well, I can't do this because my dad says so. But when you're an adult, you like I almost define an adult as transcending that belief, right? It's like, you have to come up with your own epistemology on how you come to gather stuff, and not depend on, oh, well, it's true because this person says it or that person says it. And then it's also like, well, if someone doesn't believe in that person, then there's no moving forward with this. This is why I really struggle with people that say, oh, well, the Bible says this and therefore it's true. It's like, okay, well, other Christians, not even every Christian's going to agree with you with whatever you say. But then if someone doesn't accept the Bible, you literally have zero chance of even talking to them on that. So anyway,
he's viewing it through the historical context. He's willingly ignoring some historical facts, and then he goes on to discuss how Christians will have cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias, but yet Islam actually denies the crucifixion. They say that somebody else was crucified in his place. And that brings me to the part of the video where I wanted to discuss where I really disagreed with Jordan, right? So towards the end of the interview, Muhammad gives Jordan kind of like a proposition. He says, hey, if I can show you enough evidence that believing in Islam as the correct worldview, if I could show you that evidence, would you convert to Islam? And Jordan's response was no. And I found this to be a little mind-boggling. His whole entire career was launched on fighting for truth.
Yeah, I feel like you just completely missed the point of that part of the video, right? Like the point isn't if you gave me enough evidence to convince me to believe, I wouldn't believe. It's he was saying like what Muhammad was talking about in that interview, the discussion was saying here's a bunch of evidence that I have that claims that apparently like if I have any Muslims in my audience, forgive me if I butcher this, but it claims and Muhammad was claiming that in the Quran it says that uh, Muhammad the Prophet made these prophecies and made these predictions about the future, and then a lot of them have already played out, because he made the prophecies 1,300 years ago or whatever. And so you can look back at history and look at the prophecies that he made and look they occurred, and therefore that's evidence for the validity of Muhammad. And what Jordan Peterson is saying is, that's not how I come to have what I believe in, right? It's like the way I come to believe in something is not through propositional reasoning alone, right? And it's like I will believe in this if I find it compelling, right? And I watched this other guy. I might react to him. His name's Sufi Alchemy. I'll leave a link in the description about him too. And he said, he was even critiquing Muhammad. And, he was a Muslim himself, and said something like, Jordan will believe when Allah opens his heart to it, right? And I feel like that's the correct answer. It's like I will be convinced of your faith when it speaks to me in such a way that it compels me to believe in it because I have no choice, because it's overwhelming, because it moves me and changes me as someone than who I was. And it's like that is what will convince me, not some propositional reasoning and saying like, oh, well, this is contradiction, but this isn't, and whatever. It's like, well, that's not the deepest form of belief. The deepest form of belief is something that transcends even rationality. And so, and that's the point that Jordan Peterson's making. But I don't think this guy is picking up on this even at all.
Like objective truth exists, and
that's not what Jordan Peterson is famous for. It's not asserting that objective truth exists. But the whole thing with Bill C-16 in Canada, he was fighting back against the idea of compelled speech, right? It wasn't saying, he wasn't asserting objectively, like, oh, trans people are this and you're saying that. It was, I don't want to be forced to speak something that I don't personally believe in, right? And it was being forced to behave and act and think in a particular way. And he viewed that as like anti-liberal, right? Because it's like an authoritarian reach in some sense to say you have to think this way and talk this way and behave this way, period. And it's like it's like an anti-liberal sentiment to do that. That's what he was pushing back against. It wasn't pushing it back that, there is objective truth. And then even if there is objective truth, which I think most people reasonably agree with, I definitely agree that it exists, we don't know it. And Jordan Peterson would even say that. I think even in this interview, he said, we don't know that. Right? So it's like, that I don't know. Anyway.
This mindset of, look, objective truth exists, and you can't tell me to believe your subjective truth and force me to say these things as if they're true when they're not, and I'm going to fight for my right to not be forced to speak in the way that you want me to speak because the way you want me to speak is untrue.
It's not because it's untrue. That's the thing. Like, that's not the point of this. That's not the point of what you're saying. Like, he believes that it's untrue. Not that it's... Like this is the thing. You'd think that religious people would understand this among all other people. That it's like, it's not about whether or not it's true. It's about understanding your belief system, right? And it's like, Jordan Peterson has a particular belief system. And then the First Amendment, which, he's in Canada, and it's not exactly the same, but kind of at least the spirit of the First Amendment, the idea of freedom of speech, is that we all have different beliefs and different ideas about the world, and we should have a right to be able to discuss those and put them out into the public sphere, to have a dialogue to try to, transcend our ignorance. And that's what he's pushing back against. It's not pushing it back against the fact that somehow Jordan Peterson believes that he knows the truth, although this guy seems to think that he knows the truth. But that's not what Jordan Peterson's point was. It wasn't, I know the truth and they're wrong. It's, you're stifling the mechanism by which we think as a society.
Somebody who kind of had their career launched, and I know he didn't intentionally like, yeah, I'm going to launch my career on this, but to have your career launched on kind of that foundation, and then to be presented with the proposition that says, hey, if I could show you enough evidence that this is true.
Right, the proposition. He even says this in the interview, that my belief is deeper than just pure proposition. Like, it's a deeper level of knowing than just propositional logic and reason, you know? And that's his whole point. So to say, you know, that if I gave you a set of propositions and showed evidence for their existence, would you believe? It's like, well, no, because proposition and belief are different things, right? Like, and another way that you could say this is too technical. Like, what's more important, what you say or how you act, right? If someone says, oh, I'm a good person, and then they, you know, like steal from you and they're not there for you and they, you know, are not reliable at all, and then it's kind of like, well, okay, well, which one do I believe? Well, I said this. You know, it's like, well, you know, like, just because you say it doesn't mean you believe it because you're not acting it out. And that's what Jordan Peterson would say, is it's, you know, it's like, in that analogy, saying something is propositional, but then how you act is, it's deeper than just your propositional understanding of things. And so Jordan Peterson says he's more convinced if something could speak to that element of me, not speak to me at a propositional level.
And you come to the conclusion that this is true, would you convert to Islam? To have the response of no, it's just like mind-blowing to me. Because truth is truth. If Islam is the true worldview.
How do you know that? How would you ever show this about literally anything? How would you know whether Christianity is the truth, the end-all be-all statement, or Islam is the truth, or quantum mechanics is the truth, or general relativity, or any of this stuff? We don't know the truth, right? Like, my God, man.
And the evidence points to it being the true worldview. Why would you not convert to Islam? That makes no sense. Same thing with Christianity. If Christianity is the correct worldview, which I believe it is, and I believe that there's enough evidence for it, and that's actually what brought me to Christianity, was the evidence that we have. If it's the correct worldview, and I can show you the evidence that shows you that it is the correct worldview.
Yeah, show me the evidence then. You have the evidence. How come there's 2.4 billion Christians and it's not 7 billion? You had the evidence for it, right? I mean, it's like, Jesus Christ, it's such a stupid take, you know? Like, if you had the evidence that's convincing to all people, then in your conception, why is it that not all people believe in this? Like, how do you make sense of that? Maybe it's that you don't actually have all the evidence that would irrefutably show this, because, in fact, you actually can't do that about anything, and that's kind of his whole point, you know? All right, I feel like I've kind of said my spiel on this. I'll leave it there. Till next time.